Welcome to the Church and Culture Podcast, a weekly discussion with Dr. James Emery White on the latest trends happening in culture and where and how the church should respond. Jim is the founding and senior pastor of Mecklenburg Community Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, president of Serious Times, a ministry devoted to exploring the intersection of faith and culture, former professor of theology and culture at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, where he also served as their fourth president, and the author of more than 20 books. I am your host, Alexis Dry, and I can't wait to dive into this week's conversation. Welcome back. On a recent episode, we discussed how American culture at large is losing trust in Christian pastors, but then we followed that episode with one on the incredible popularity of the He Gets Us campaign, which focuses on the love and compassion of Jesus. Now, we've also discussed the rise of the nuns, and those are people who refuse to identify with any particular religion, but who aren't opposed to believing in God. Now, put that together with another podcast we did on the many high-profile religious leaders who have been in the news recently for immoral, sometimes illegal acts. And it's not too difficult to come to the conclusion that in America, at least, people are still somewhat interested or turned on to God, and specifically to Jesus, but very turned off to religion, pastors, and even just your average self-identified Christian. They're saying maybe to Christ, but absolutely not to Christianity or becoming a Christian. And really, can we blame them? Like, Jim, I know that this might not be the most optimistic of all conversations that we've had and a little disheartening to talk about, but I think still important, which is to address some of the leading reasons why the Christian faith is being perceived as anything but Christian. Specifically, I want to talk about the major turnoffs to Christianity as displayed by its leaders and its followers. And those turnoffs are legalism, judgmentalism, hypocrisy, intolerance, and sexism. Now, before we jump in, though,
Lions and tigers and bears.
There's so many times when I'm thinking, I'm so glad to be the one asking the questions and not answering them. And this is certainly one of those times. But anyways, before we jump in, I would love for you to quickly address those who maybe are a little keen to skip this episode, either because of it's just uncomfortable to talk about it or to be identified with these turnoffs, or because maybe they think that, hey, I'm just the holy exception to all that they're going to talk about today.
I hope that people are very interested in this for at least a couple of reasons, because I'm interested in it. One reason is because I don't want to be, and I would assume they don't want to be, you don't want to be that kind of Christian. I mean, we don't. So there should be some interest level for that reason alone. But second, I would hope people are interested because they care deeply about those who are far from God, who are finding this to be a barrier to God. They want to see this impasse bridged for the sake of the cause of Christ, which means as Christians, we need some kind of answer to these concerns, some kind of answer to these accusations, these things that people want to reject the faith over. When they're being raised by our friends, by our family members, by our neighbors and such. When we think about Christian apologetics, which is the study of the defense of the faith, the reasons for our faith, we're used to answering certain questions or challenges, things like, is there a God? Is the Bible trustworthy or is it historically accurate? Did Jesus rise from the dead? These are the classic questions of apologetics and that we often read about, learn about, train ourselves about. But we aren't as versed in answering issues related to, say, sexism or lack of tolerance. But we need to be. So as we go through these, with your blessing, that will certainly be on my mind as I try to respond to each one. And in answering them, giving something of a beginning apologetic for them that, if you will, I think Christians will not only be served in their response and relations with non-Christians, but also might be served personally. Because let's face it, Christians are being troubled by these issues too. And so for all of these reasons, I think it's very, very important we spend some time on this and try to understand these turnoffs and also get a sense of how to think about them in relation to our faith and the potential faith of our friends.
All right, well, let's start with legalism. Christians are certainly familiar with this concept if they've read any of the Gospels, because Jesus took the religious leaders of his day to task for legalism. But how does a modern-day non-Christian experience legalism at the hands of Christians?
Let's talk peanut butter.
Oh, that's not what I thought you were going to say.
In just a minute.
Okay.
Let's begin by saying that legalism is putting a bunch of do's and don'ts on to people to follow in the name of God that God did not put on them. It's a religion of added rules and regulations and standards and stipulations and codes and conduct contrived by someone to determine who is and who is not spiritual. It's being asked, if not forced, mandated to measure up in a way that can be binding and brutal and discouraging and defeating. And it feels like about 1,000,000 miles away from anything authentic, anything life-changing, anything freeing. In his book, Grace Awakening, Chuck Swindoll writes about a missionary family who had been sent to a place that did not have peanut butter. Mm. They happened to really like peanut butter, and they had young kids. So they had arranged for some friends to send them a jar every now and then. Other missionaries in the area liked peanut butter too, but since it wasn't readily available, they began to see being peanut butter free as a badge of spiritual honor, almost what it meant to be spiritual. So much so that when the new missionary family had it shipped in, they began to view them as somehow not quite sacrificing for Jesus. It got so bad, they had to end up leaving the mission field. The legalism was so petty, so unbelievably small-minded, the pressure so intense that they returned to the States. That's the nature of legalism. It reduces spirituality to outward practices and outward norms. Another way of thinking about it is I remember reading many years ago an article in the Wall Street Journal on UPS, United Parcel, and how much pride they take in the productivity of their workforce. On the average, a UPS driver delivers, I think the article said something like 400 packages a day. And here's how they do it. They micromanage every detail of that driver's routine. The article said 3,000 industrial engineers to dictate every single task. They're taught to step from their trucks with their right foot. They have to hold their money face up. They have to carry their packages under their left arm. UPS even tells their drivers how fast to walk from the truck to the point of delivery. At that point in time, it had to be 3 feet per second. They even tell them how to hold their keys with the teeth up using their third finger. And if a driver is considered slow, then they're accompanied on their route by a supervisor who pushes them through the steps with a clipboard and stopwatch. Now, for the package delivery business, that works. In the spirituality business, it does not, and was never meant to. Because spirituality is not about religion or rituals, routines, or rites. It is about relationship. This is actually what set up the tension between Jesus and the religious leaders of his day, the teachers of the law, and the group known as the Pharisees. They were very religious, considered to be the holiest people of the day. And as we've talked about before, they had taken the Old Testament and the New and calculated that it contained 248 commandments, 365 prohibitions, lifted them out, vowed to obey every single one. But to make sure they didn't break those laws, they made laws about the laws and rules about the rules, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and then laws about the laws and so forth. When Jesus came along, what he had to say about this was very direct. He said, he uttered the prophetic declaration against them. He said, "Woe to you," which was as strong as a prophet can bring about a condemnation. You're loading people down with burdens that they can barely carry. And Jesus hated that about legalism. Not only does it kill the heart and cripple people's spiritual life, but in many ways it makes a mockery of it. It really does, because it's all, if it's all about legalism, then you can play the law like a tax collector or like a tax lawyer would, chasing loopholes, chasing technicalities, focusing on the letter of the law, but never its spirit. And following Jesus is not about what you do, but about who you are. So if you're tired of legalism, you're not turned off to Christianity, much less Jesus. What you're turned off to is a counterfeit, which is a good thing. So Christians should be denouncing legalism as much as anyone.
I didn't realize your peanut butter example would hit so close to home. When I was a missionary overseas, I was sent to a place without peanut butter. And you better believe when people sent me care packages, I said, if you don't mind just throwing some peanut butter in, that would be so great. So obviously it just points to how unspiritual I am, I guess. Okay, let's move on to judgmentalism. Again, Jesus very clearly stated, do not judge, or you too will be judged. And yet that has not stopped us. Can you get to the heart of judgmentalism and share where we're most guilty of it?
Yeah, David Kinnaman and Gabe Lyons did a major study on people who had turned away from the Christian faith and wrote a book about it. And I had a very small role in that particular book. Who had turned away from the church. And number one on the list was encountering people who were judgmental. We all know the type. People who are prideful, act morally superior, and then from that find fault with everybody else. Judgmental people lack compassion, they lack understanding, they lack grace toward other people's failings. The judgmental people seem more interested in condemning than in helping people. If you've encountered this spirit, you really have every right to be absolutely repulsed by it. It's a terrible thing to experience, and even more tragic is to find it among those who claim to follow Jesus. Because when it comes to our desire for grace, that incredible commodity that sees us for who we really are, not just our mistakes and our failures and our flaws, that dispenser of forgiveness, that spirit that restores those who are falling, so amazing that we sing about it in songs called Amazing Grace, that powerful force unleashed on the planet by Jesus himself. How devastating to find that sometimes the last people that it's found is with people claiming the name of Jesus. So what happened, right? It's simple. Those people stopped being very Jesus-y because Jesus went out of his way to tell people who followed him, whatever you do, don't judge people. That's God's job. That is not yours. Now, to be fair, when someone says, don't judge me, it's often code for saying, don't you dare say that anything about me or my life or my actions or my lifestyle is wrong or bad in any way. That's not what being judgmental is about. Real judgmentalism is about the practice of personal condemnation. The judgmental person that Jesus is talking about is someone who is a fault finder, who is negative and destructive toward other people. And when you encounter it, it's just not reflective of Jesus or the life that he calls us to. The real spirit of Jesus is truth, to be sure, but coupled always with grace, never separated from grace. Christians are, in truth, nothing but a colossal collection of moral foul-ups, sins of pride, and greed and pornography and self-righteousness and lying and stealing and adultery and insensitivity to others. But through the power of Christ, there's hope for all of us. And what we want to do as a Christian community is to expose those areas in our life, not deny them or rationalize them away, not in a way that condemns, but in a way that transforms. We want to discover them, go to God for forgiveness, and become increasingly changed people. It's extremely messy, but really beautiful.
Now, we've talked before about how authenticity, let's just say even the appearance of it, is becoming more and more attractive to younger generations in particular. Now, in light of that, where are they seeing a lack of authenticity, or put it another way, hypocrisy among Christians?
Everywhere they look. And I think the reason it feels that way more now than ever is because of the internet, social media, and the prevalence of it. I have just been walking around grieved often, where it feels like every week, sometimes it feels like every day, another major figure is falling in one form or another. And I know how that feels. I mean, I didn't become, on a personal level, and it started young for me early on. I didn't, become a Christ follower until I was 20. When I did, it was through some friends who invited me to a college outreach ministry, and one of my early heroes, as you imagine, was the president of that campus movement. He was smart, and he was disciplined. He was a gifted teacher. I read his books, and I marveled at his leadership, and I even tried to model parts of my life after his in terms of disciplines and such. And then I got the opportunity to actually hear him at a conference. And not only that, but he and his wife were going to lead a breakout seminar on marriage that was designed for 20-something college singles who were beginning to think about this along the lines for their life. It was a smaller setting, so I got to see him and his wife up close. I remember I even got to ask a question or two. It was great. It was everything I hoped it would be. It was very impressive. And I walked away more impressed than ever. Just a few months later, the news broke. It came out that he had been in an affair with another woman. A several months long affair.
Mm.
And to make it even worse for me as I did the math, he was in the middle of that affair while he was leading that marriage seminar with his wife. The one that I sat in on and was taking notes on, the one where I was thinking the whole time, this is what I want to be in a marriage. This is the kind of man that I want to be. And the utter sheer hypocrisy of it made me just want to go find a corner and vomit. I don't know if you probably have, but I hope not. But I don't know if you've ever been burned like that or been disillusioned like I was, but it makes you question everything. But I didn't abandon the Christian faith. And though it wouldn't be the last time that I experienced that disillusionment, I've experienced it even in recent years on a very deep, personal, visceral level with people that I felt like I was running the race with. But I realized something very important early on that has been with me my whole life. Just like with legalism and just like with judgmentalism, hypocrisy has absolutely nothing to do with Jesus. Nothing. Nothing. Less than nothing. Just like he did with those deformities, Jesus went on the warpath against it. In fact, he's the one who started the war. A lot of people don't realize that the word hypocrite didn't launch onto the spiritual scene until Jesus. He was the one who launched it into the spiritual vocabulary. He's the one who introduced the world to the idea in that particular application because it was a theater term. The word hypocrite literally means mask wearer. It came from the theatrical world of ancient Greece. Greek actors you've probably seen the typical masks for ancient Greece that kind of represent that, but they'd be on sticks. And the mask would be attached to the stick, and you would hold that mask in front of you when you were on stage, the mask that represented your character, and you would speak from behind the mask. And that's what the word hypocrite means, to speak from behind the mask. You're not who you are. You've got this facade. And so it's actually a very, very, very apt term. It's very telling and cutting that Jesus used it. And he just applied it to people's lives. So what many people cite as the reason for rejecting Christianity and Christ had nothing to do with authentic Christian faith, much less Jesus. Now, having said that, let's be really clear about what hypocrisy isn't. It isn't somebody who just fails your expectations of perfection. It's not about catching someone who says they follow Jesus. It's not about catching them sinning. If that's what a hypocrite is, you can add me to the list, put me at the top. You come spend a day with me and I will disappoint you. I won't set out to do that. I won't try to be two-faced about it, but I'll disappoint you. I'm a sinful man and my sin will be, I'm sure, readily apparent. So does that automatically make me a hypocrite? Just because I consistently fail being like and living like and acting like and loving like Jesus, just because I screw up, just because I sin, so a Christian means perfection? Oh my goodness, no one would believe that, and rightfully so. And what a terrible distortion of the Christian faith that would be. Yet this idea runs rampant, and not just among those who aren't Christians, but among those who are, or would like to be. So many times I've heard, and you've heard me address this in public settings where I'm talking to non-Christians, and they're thinking about making a decision for Christ. I have to get this out of their head as well. Listen, coming to Christ doesn't mean you have your act together. It's about admitting you don't. Being baptized is not when you just reach that point of sinless perfection, or from that point on, you're going to be modeling that. It's realizing, man, I'm dirty. I need to be washed. So many times I've heard someone say, I don't want to say I'm a Christian. I don't want to become a Christian. I don't want to go to church as if I am a Christian. I don't want to be baptized as a Christian because I don't want to be a hypocrite. And here's what they're thinking. Being a Christ follower means being perfect. Being a hypocrite means saying you're a Christ follower and not being perfect. So since they don't want to be a hypocrite, they don't want to associate themselves with Christians, the church, or Christ. And that is as officially screwed up as hypocrisy is. The truth is that the opposite of hypocrisy is not perfection. It's very important. The opposite of hypocrisy is not perfection. The opposite of hypocrisy is spiritual authenticity. I screw up 1,000 times a day, but I hope I'm more like Jesus now than I was 5 years ago, at least in some areas of my life. And more importantly, the life I would be living apart from Christ, whether there's always consistent growth or not, is really unthinkable for me. The Christian faith is very unique in holding to the idea that the first step toward authentic spirituality is not about having your act together. It's knowing that you don't, which means an authentic Christian life isn't marked by perfection. It's marked by transformation. I love. I mean, I love how C.S. Lewis talked about this in Mere Christianity. I always felt this was such a obvious application and way of thinking about it, but it's so telling and so insightful. He said that you may observe, for example, that a particular Christian woman you know, let's call her Mary, has a much more difficult time keeping away from gossip than a non-Christian woman that you know. Let's call her Betty. So you see Mary, the gossiping Christian, and Betty, the non-gossiping non-Christian. And it actually makes you just kind of think, well, Mary's a hypocrite. Or that maybe the whole Christian life thing doesn't have any potency. But that misses the process of transformation. And here's the real issue that Lewis brings up. What would Mary be like if she wasn't in a relationship with Christ? And what would Betty be like if she was? See, we're all works in progress and have different areas of strengths and different areas of weaknesses. And God meets every one of us where we are, and he begins there, and praise to him that he does.
Yeah. Well, next up, I want to go back to something that you hinted on in a previous response, and that's this whole issue of intolerance. And I feel like in our kind of modern post-Christian culture, if there's any word that's taboo right now, it's intolerant. People want to feel both accepted and affirmed in all areas of their life. But certainly Christians theologically are intolerant to the idea that everything is true and that all lifestyles should be affirmed. So is that why Christians are often labeled as intolerant, or do you think there's more to it than that?
I think we need to clear up our thinking on this. And even when we're accused of this, be bold in our apologetics about helping people understand exactly what the Christian faith is trying to say. Today, being tolerant is a cardinal virtue. And when you push people what they mean by that, they'll usually say things about the importance of accepting others and being respectful of their opinions and their lifestyles, which I would agree with. Totally, 100%. No issue with that whatsoever. But you push even further, and you find that what they really mean is affirming all ideas, affirming all choices, affirming all lifestyles as equally valid, true, and right. Now I've got a problem. I'm not tolerant that way. I don't think you're tolerant that way. I don't think anyone actually is tolerant that way. And I don't mean this in a condescending way, but if they think about it, there's three kinds of tolerance. The first is legal tolerance. And this is where we need to kind of sharpen up our definition. Because when you say tolerance, you got to say, well, what kind of tolerance are we talking about? First kind of tolerance is legal tolerance. If you're an American, for example, this has to do with our basic First Amendment right to believe whatever it is we want to believe. There's nothing that Jesus put forward or the Bible would teach that would go to war against that idea. In fact, the Bible is a great advocate of legal tolerance. Many would say that Scripture is the basis of our whole legal system that gives those kind of freedoms. Second kind of tolerance is social tolerance. This is accepting someone else as a human being, regardless of what they believe, and interacting with them in love and exhibiting a relational openness to them as a fellow human being. Nothing in the Christian faith that would stand against that either. There is absolutely, if Jesus stood for anything, it was open, loving acceptance of other people as those who mattered to God. In fact, he so reached out to what were considered the dregs of society, the rejects of society, the fringes of society of his day, the prostitutes, the marketplace scoundrels, the thieves, that he was given the nickname a friend of sinners, and that was not considered complimentary. The third kind of tolerance is intellectual tolerance. This is accepting any and every idea as being equally valid, good, right, and true. And that's where Christianity draws in line. And I think in truth, we all do. I remember being on a plane to Las Vegas, and a woman boarded in a sleeveless shirt with a huge tattoo on her shoulder that said, F the world, only she spelled that F word out fully. I fully support her right to have that tattoo. I really do. I would be happy to be in a loving and accepting relationship with her as a friend. But I absolutely don't agree with what she had inscribed on her body as a guiding life philosophy, and would actually enjoy the opportunity to tell her why. Is that being intolerant? Sure it is. Not socially, not legally, but intellectually. The point is that I don't believe that everyone and everything was equally right or equally valid. There is right and wrong, true and false, good and bad, smart and dumb. But I think that's where all of us are at. I don't think any of us really believe in, uncurtailed intellectual tolerance, that all ideas are equally valid and should be treated as such. I mean, think about something as mundane as someone approaching you and saying, I think that the best way for you to have a great online experience is to remove your antivirus protection.
Yeah.
Then, after you've done that, open up every email attachment from people and companies you don't know. Download as much free software as you can from sites you have never heard of. Oh, and definitely respond to that email from that lawyer about that distant cousin of yours you didn't know existed from Nigeria, who only needs your bank account and social security number to give you your $1 million inheritance. And you could easily be tolerant of that person legally, not to mention relationally, without buying into everything that they might say about how to handle yourself online. When we talk about the importance of tolerance, we mean legal tolerance. We mean social tolerance. I don't think we mean intellectual tolerance. So let's bring this back to spiritual things. When Jesus said things like he was the way, the truth, and the life, it wasn't simply a declaration. It was an invitation. He wasn't refusing anyone their right to believe differently. He wasn't rejecting anyone socially or culturally. He was just saying, look, I'm the way to knowing God is the Father. There's one God and there's one way, there is a God. He's not confused about who he is and what he stands for and what is true, right, and wrong. I'm here to make it foundationally and fundamentally clear. And that's true for lifestyle issues as well. It's not just, theological. If the only kind of acceptance you will accept involves affirmation, then you're saying the only kind of tolerance that you will accept includes intellectual tolerance. And this would mean that any and every lifestyle choice must be affirmed as equally good and safe and vibrant and fulfilling and holy as any other. And that's simply not reality. I mean, when people just say, oh, but you have to be affirming of these lifestyles, I'll just say, okay, after we walk through the different kinds of tolerance, I'll often say, is there not any lifestyle that you can imagine that you think should be universally condemned? And they'll think a minute and they'll say, well, yeah, probably something against children. I say, well, I would agree. So you've just agreed that there's a limit to intellectual tolerance and that it's not wrong to have intellectual intolerance. So why don't we just work from there?
That's great. Well, we've got one more to go. Patriarchal Christianity has certainly come under the limelight as women have been finding their voices, and I'd add finding the platforms to express them on. Now, while those within the church are certainly used to the age-old complementarian, egalitarian debates, those outside the church are not using that type of language or terminology. They're just saying that Christians are sexist. So what are they pointing to as their evidence?
Sexist Christians. I mean, they're there. I mean, let's face it. Sexism is part, just like they can find hypocrisy and judgmentalism and intolerance and all those kinds of things. But here's what I would argue: that if you try to get it from the Bible, you won't find it. Mm-hmm. That if you try and get it from the Bible, you're deeply misguided. You're deeply misinformed. Let's talk about that. The classic definition of sexism is the economic exploitation and or social domination of members of one sex by another. And specifically, historically in our world, of women by men. It's when women are discriminated against, when they're stereotyped, when there's prejudice, just because they're women. Misogyny, or having a misogynistic attitude or being misogynistic in your behavior, is about a negative attitude toward women, having hostility toward women. So there's kind of a difference between those two. And in fact, the word misogyny literally means someone who is a hater of women, which makes it so disturbing that in the minds of many, the Christian faith is perceived to be deeply sexist or even misogynistic, that an undercurrent of misogyny runs through our veins. And it's, so we have to ask ourselves, is that true? Well, while the Bible doesn't flinch from recording the sexual misdeeds of its characters, it doesn't flinch from its denunciation of them either. There is no place in God's economy that you can find for sexual harassment, assault, or rape. There is no place for using positions of power or influence to coerce or pressure someone into sexual favors. And the call to how we should interact with people of the opposite sex as men on a daily basis is also very, very clear. When the Apostle Paul wrote to a man named Timothy that he was mentoring in life for leadership and ministry, he said, you need to treat other women this way. He said, older women, treat them as mothers. Younger women, as sisters. I would say super younger women, daughters. And then he adds, with absolute purity. With absolute purity. You just can't get past the opening page of the Bible. Not pages, page of the Bible without things related to sexism being exploded and denounced and made very clear that it has no place in anything related to God. I mean, the creation narrative itself is obviously what I'm referring to. In the opening pages of the Bible, the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis, we read that God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female. He created them. When God created mankind, he made us male and female. Both were made equally in the image of God. There's not more of the image of God in one than there is the other. We were giving a mutual charge. People miss this, a mutual charge to steward the world, which means that there's not an ounce of sexism in what God created, how God created, or the intent of God's creation as men and women. When sexism becomes entrenched due to our sinful natures, and sexism is a result of sin, God wasted no time addressing his fundamental disorder, and supremely in the coming of Jesus to planet Earth. I mean, during the time of Jesus, sexism just was running rampant. In the Greco-Roman world of that time, women were so terribly devalued. It's just tragic. If you had a baby girl, you had the option to discard her simply because she was a girl. People wanted sons, so if they had a daughter, they could just put the baby girl on the doorstep. Then people would come around and take those infant girls and raise them to be slaves or prostitutes. There was even a prayer where a Jewish man would thank God for three things: that he was not a slave, that he was not a Gentile, and that he was not a woman. Women were treated as mere objects that could be used for work, sexual fulfillment, and then divorced in just a heartbeat without any penalty or societal concern. A man could get a divorce from his wife for anything from a badly cooked meal to the mere fact that he found her less beautiful than another woman. And then he could remarry at will. But she was left, much like that baby girl on the doorstep, to fend for herself without any support or any hope. Jesus barreled his way through that. He just did not treat women that way. He did not view women that way. He invited them to follow him and to be among his burgeoning church. He treated them with respect and honor and enormous sensitivity. He made it clear that they were anything but second-class citizens. I mean, I go back to this and I just, the more you study this culturally and do the biblical work on this, the more shocking it is for that day, which was Mary and the resurrection. She was the first person that he appeared to following his resurrection, and he gave her the charge of telling his male followers that he had indeed risen from the dead. The biggest news in the history of the world, the biggest declaration in the history of the world, was entrusted to a woman to tell men. That was a cultural bombshell. The Bible records that the first witness to Jesus after he was raised from the dead was a woman, and not only the first witness, but the one person Jesus tasked to go and tell all the men what had happened. And again, in the ancient Near Eastern culture of that day, and you know this, women were extremely low on the societal totem pole, so low that even their testimony was not accepted in the Jewish courts of law. Even if multiple women were eyewitnesses of the same event, it was not accepted in a court of law. Yet Jesus purposefully went to a single woman and chose her to be his eyewitness to tell everybody, and not simply to other women, but to tell men. He could have appeared to anyone. He could have tasked anyone, and he purposefully chose Mary. Don't tell me he didn't have a glint in his eye when he did it. He purposefully chose to take a baseball bat to any and all sexism, purposefully and powerfully dictated that sexism had no place in his kingdom. He radically affirmed the full dignity of women, the vital value of their witness, and their role in the life of the revolution that he came to unleash on the planet. And because of this, from the very first moments of the early Christian church, the unheard of took root immediately. Women were involved, treated as equals. Men and women may have had different roles or different responsibilities, but they were on completely equal footing before God. In the New Testament, we find them speaking in the church and teaching in the church and helping provide leadership to the church groups meeting in their homes where they were the primary leader of that group. You have names such as Phoebe and Priscilla and Mary and Martha becoming as prominent as any man's.
All right, we've got it all out in the open at this point, but I don't want to end here. Let's end with a call to action. What are Christians supposed to do now with all of this information?
Well, this can be short and sweet, I think.
Okay.
Whenever you encounter legalism or judgmentalism, hypocrisy, intolerance, sexism, you are not encountering authentic Christianity. Christians should be condemning it as much, if not more, than the world, and of course, eradicating it from their lives and their churches. And they should be able to give a reason for this to the world who might accuse them of this, and to be able to have an answer to every man, to every woman, an answer for the hope that lies within them.
Well said. Thank you, Jim. And thank you guys for giving us your ear again for this 30, 40 minutes or so. We hope it was valuable to you as always, and we hope you'll tune in again next week.